سلام. اليوم معكم الحلقة الأولى من البودكاست ديال كافي هيستوري، ومازال الخير القدام. بقاو على القرص.
Dr. Derek L. Elliott is Assistant Professor of History at Akhawayn University in Ifrane, Morocco. Before moving to the Middle Atlas Mountains, he completed a doctorate at the University of Cambridge. His research examines different lived experiences of colonialism at the intersection of law and violence within the British Imperial world. He's currently preparing a monograph on the use of extrajudicial state violence in governed in 19th century South India.
ديريك آل إليوت هو أستاذ تاريخ بجامعة الأخوين بإفران في المغرب. قبل ما يتحول لجبال الأطلس المتوسط كمل الدكتوراه ديالو بجامعة كامبريدج في المملكة المتحدة. الأبحاث ديالو كتمحور حول حياة وتجارب الناس تحت الاحتلال والاستعمار، وخصوصا تجارب الناس مع القضاء والعنف تحت الاستعمار البريطاني. كذلك أنه هو الآن كيوجد في دراسة حول استعمال العنف خارج نطاق القضاء في الحكم خلال القرن التاسع عشر بجنوب الهند.
We're glad to talk about Enlightenment today, especially this side of Enlightenment, since it's definitely a side that we do not cover as Moroccan students in our middle and high school. History lessons never hinted to Eurocentrism, and they were never critical to begin with. So we're really excited to know more about them. So first of all, we would like you to introduce us to your book, The Voyages and Manifesto of William Ferguson, a little bit.
So William Ferguson was an early 18th century ship's surgeon, so medical doctor, back before the medical profession was as professionalized as it is now. And he sailed in the 1730s. He made a series of 3 different voyages to ports in the east. So he visited destinations such as Mocha in Yemen, all up and down the coasts of India, hitting Malacca in today's Malaysia, and in Canton or Guangzhou in China. And he, made several stops in Cape Town and St. Helena, an island in the Atlantic, in between. And he wrote these diaries, he said, for his own private memoirs, and they have been sitting basically underutilized in the Center for South Asian Studies archive at the University of Cambridge, where I came across them as a doctoral student. And so this book is published with the Akhawayn Society, which probably most of the listeners won't be familiar with, but almost every historian is, because the Akhawayn Society was founded in 1846, and for this express purpose, a group of scholars, such as, for example, Charles Darwin served on the first council of them, a name that should be familiar to just about anyone, right? And they publish these kinds of primary sources along with scholarly annotations and an introduction. And so what really stood out to me about this particular guy and why the Akhawayn Society wanted to go forward with publishing it is because he travels at a time of the what is commonly referred to as the early Enlightenment. So he's again in the 1730s. And he spends a lot of time talking about the ideas, those popular ideas of the Enlightenment during his voyages. So it's more than just a standard travelogue. It also gives an interesting insight into an unknown, relatively common, although also, educated and fairly well off individual of that time. And so it gives a little bit of a different perspective than what most people, I think, are used to hearing about when they think of the Enlightenment.
So if you can tell us a little bit of these ideas that he gives us in his diaries.
And so the Enlightenment, typically how it's understood in the global North, is that it's this 100 years or 150 years, maybe 1650 to about the French Revolution, 1789, where Europe emerges, if you will, as an intellectual, economic, and technological powerhouse, if you will, that opens the door to European imperialism in places that it wasn't able to gain major inroads in before, or at least major territorial inroads. So I'm talking mainly about the Indian Ocean sphere here, conveniently ignoring what's been going on in the Americas for the last 200 years, right? And so what the ideas of the Enlightenment, what it was really all about is, or at least how it was understood, is that there was this belief in a universal condition of mankind. And I say mankind purposely because it's a dated concept, and scholars have been pointing out almost from the very beginning that it really wasn't very universal at all, right? It didn't mainly take into account non-European histories, people of color, and of course women, which made up, at least half of European society at the time, even if we just want to talk about Europe. So it's an incredibly problematic, kind of thing, and because it is seen as this thing that brought, or this series of events, or this culminating, however we want to conceive of it, because this kind of brought Europe into global power, it has the dominant narrative of it has been one of European exceptionalism. And so to tie it back to the book, William Ferguson, this surgeon, he's traveling in a period, of the early 18th century, and he believes in this universalism, and he does have prejudicial ideas for sure, but he doesn't believe that Europe is superior in every way. In fact, the country that he holds up as the model is early 18th century China.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's actually interesting. What we want to ask next is, why do you think was the historical narrative of this period of the Enlightenment exclusive to Europeans?
Well, I mean, I think the way that Europeans considered it, in many ways, they considered it exclusively to Europeans. For the most part, a couple of times people were forced, like in France during the French Revolution, when former slaves rebelled in what is today Haiti, or then the colony of Saint-Domingue. They challenged the very ideas of the Enlightenment, and basically said, "Are we not men too?" Generals like Toussaint Louverture and others. And they were able to make sure that the Revolutionary Council there, that they in Paris, that they actually, they abolished slavery, and they were given, certain, their input was heard, even if it was more limited. Of course, by the time Napoleon comes in, all that is gone. So I don't think certainly the way that Europeans have thought of the Enlightenment has been almost exclusively European, but of course, and scholars are more and more realizing this, and more research is coming out, which I hope my book will help contribute to, that shows that, there were a lot more than just Europeans going around, right? That increasingly, the Enlightenment borrows ideas, or European thoughts, European intellectuals borrow ideas and concepts, from around the world, and technologies as well, and bring them back into Europe.
And what I wanted to know particularly is, how can we link this to imperialism, and especially if we take, for example, something that we know, for example, North Africa and the colonization of North Africa?
Well, I don't know about linking it directly to decolonization in North Africa, but what really develops in the Enlightenment is this idea of European superiority, right? That is so firmly in place by the, I would say, mid 19th century that, Europeans, like most other peoples around the world, believed themselves to be, or believed their own societies to be more, to be better, in quotes, if you will, than others. And if we were read old Mughal travelogues, or read old Chinese travelogues or writings, and other Arab chroniclers, this is generally a theme that flows through these things, right? Most people in their societies tend to believe that their society, at least is, again, air quotes, even though this is a podcast, better in some ways than others, right?
Yeah.
But by the mid 19th century, as the Enlightenment then flows into, its tangible effects, i.e., the Industrial Revolution, Europeans believe that they can, or Europeans not only believe that they're superior, but they believe that they have the proofs of their superiority all around them.
Mm-hmm.
Their economies are taking off, technology is taking off, right? So on and so forth, right? The social conditions of the Industrial Revolution is a whole nother story, but in general, society is getting much wealthier, and they believe that they are indeed superior, and it's based on this technology. And this comes out of this is not new. This is not a new idea, right? Michael Adas, in his Machines as the Measures of Man, put this forward in 1989. But what I think, and so the problem, or how these things are connected then, is that Europeans come to believe that they're superior. They believe that they have the proofs of their superiority, right? And all this is backed up by racist pseudoscience that place Europeans on some kind of higher, gradation of, humankind. And this feeds right into the major, European imperial project of the late 18th and 19th centuries, going all the way into the 20th century. So, and how this, I think, is really connected is that, in the 19th century, this is when we also get the emergence of, or actually this entire period is when we get the emergence of modern academic disciplines. Mm-hmm. Right? Herodotus may have written his histories, 2,000 years ago, and so on and so forth. But this is when we start getting, departments, history departments, and we get, scholarly societies in the 18th and 19th centuries, and journals, and we get the professionalization, right, of the academy at this time. And so with that professionalization of the academy, who are the professors? Who are the people doing these research, doing this research, right? They're the same. They're people who were brought up in generally colonial societies, right? In mm-hmm. Britain, in France, or elsewhere. And many of them never approached these kinds of ideas critically. Mm-hmm. And so, when they're writing about their colonial subjects or foreign lands, they bring these ideas, these racialized ideas, right into their scholarship and their writing. And this has formed a dominant narrative, right? And it's something that we're just getting out of in the last 40 or 50 years, right? There are still many Eurocentric historians who claim, West is best and so on and so forth. But increasingly, scholars are moving away from this and saying, no, there are much more inputs to things like the Enlightenment. And, we're discarding the racialized tones of the earlier historians, earlier scholars, so on and so forth, which is now, a case and study in itself, right? Looking at colonial historiography, the ideas of foreign peoples, the ideas of, basically non-Europeans in the world. Even though from our time, colonialism might seem kind of distant, but, last big decolonization struggles arguably were in the 1960s, right? That's my father's lifetime, right? When my father was born, India still had 2 years to go to its independence in 1947. So we have hundreds of years of, if I can speak plainly, we have hundreds of years of what is often, racist or at least racialized, writing, carried out by colonialists and colonial governments. And so we're now in a process of revising, to get we're trying to get a much more global picture, at least historians like myself are, myself and many, many others. And so to bring that point up into decolonization, right? Today when we think about, I'm assuming that you and most of your listeners are familiar with the term post-colonialism, right? But it often is only applied to countries that were former colonies. But I think probably a more accurate way of looking at the global structures of power and influence in the world, it might be more accurate to say, that the entire world, the global North and the global South, we're all living in a post-colonial society, or at least a post-European imperial society, if you will. Because the global North still benefits from the structures of colonialism. Right? I mean, if you look at aid, who are the biggest aid donors, who are the biggest aid recipients, if you look at where, the international governmental organizations are based, they tend to be in the global North. And I don't think that a lot of Europeans, through their educational system, which is still quite Eurocentric, or at least nationalistic, as almost all educational systems are, don't fully realize the structures and the imbalances of power that were put in place during the colonial era, that not only people from the global North like myself as a white cisgendered male has benefited from, extremely, but that it also, continues to be reflected, of course, in the global South as well. Does that make sense?
Yeah, makes total sense.
Yes, it does. Yeah.
Okay. I also wanted to ask about how we can link this to the cancel culture.
Yeah. So, I mean, I don't. To be honest, I don't understand this word. I'm not sure if it was coined by the right or who coined this term cancel culture. But, this cancel culture idea, this thing over whether it's Goya beans and the latest fiasco with Trump in the States, or whatever it is, but this so-called cancel culture has been in use for at least 200 years. One of the biggest boycotts in history, and one of the first most prominent international boycotts, was a British boycott started by different abolitionist groups in Britain in the early 19th century, late 18th, early 19th century, who refused to buy West Indian sugar that was being produced by slaves. And, we don't have to go that far back in time, but, apartheid. South Africa really started hurting after there were boycotts against South African apartheid, products. And so what some people, consider cancel culture, I would say, is simply a reconfiguration of power structures, or at least to a certain extent, right? It's people demanding that certain kinds of actions and behaviors that we decide are no longer tolerable.
So, how can we actually link this dominant narrative to the current ongoing protests against inequality and discrimination, and also to movements such as Black Lives Matter, and also how linked is it to the latest statue toppling witnessed in Europe and the United States?
How linked is it? I think that this is a point where, and I'm seeing a lot of this in my social media feeds. I have many American and British friends, Indian friends. I get a lot of this different news that comes in. And I think it's, people are demanding that we have new narratives. And not only just new narratives, but arguably more accurate narratives, right? I mean, history is a vast subject, right? It encompasses, technically encompasses everyone who ever lived in the whole world, in all history. But it's that. So there's always going to be a degree of cherry picking, right? Even in my world history courses, I generally have to, not because I have anything against them, but I generally ignore, Australia and these other things, right? So we always have to, you have to always kind of pick and choose, what you are teaching people. But I think now we're at a point, particularly in the United States and in Britain, where people of color and their allies have said, we're tired of this whitewashed history. Our communities are aware of these histories. They're not part of the dominant narrative, and they should be. Right? I mean, it's no longer a controversial statement to say that a lot of the wealth creation, if not, a lot of the wealth creation in the United States and across the world, even, especially if you want to be Marxist about it, takes place on the exploitation of workers. Right? In the United States' case, it's we have slavery as well as sweatshops, and these other things. But for someone myself who grew up in Canada and the United States, I'm going to date myself here, but most of my elementary school was in the 1980s, and high school was in the 1990s, and I went to school between both Canada and the United States, and we learned almost nothing about any kind of Indigenous or First Nations history. We learned almost nothing about Black history, either in Canada or the United States. We learned what slavery was, that it was bad, that it was over, and then, Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement, right? And of course, that's not how it was, right? I mean, gone are the histories of violence, gone are the histories of, and the other kinds of, there's rarely units on the Harlem Renaissance, for example, in the American curriculum. And so I think people of color and their allies are saying, no, we want a more inclusive history that accurately represents national or global history. And I think it's definitely high time. And so as far as statues, pulling down a statue of Edward Colston, a slaver who may have built, a good part of Bristol back in the 18th century. But, do these people represent the values of British society today? And if the answer to that is yes, then I think that's really problematic, right? And, to continue on this statue thing, I've been reading a lot about this, and I'm not a historian of memorialization, but I am a historian, and history is not statues, right? I think the Islamic world knows that very, very well. Don't forget your history just because there's a statue there or not, right? Erecting a statue usually comes out of the politics of the era in which the statue was erected, right? And we see that. That's one thing that definitely emerged in the United States ever since, especially since Black Lives Matter started a couple of years ago, pulling down statues of, Confederates, people who fought a war to own people. Most American students are taught that the Civil War was over the divisions between states' rights and federal rights. Mm-hmm. And quite honestly, that's never been true, because if you look at the charters of succession for most of the states that joined the Confederacy, they mention slavery something like 80 times, as other scholars have pointed out.
So my last question would be just to bring this more locally and on the Moroccan level. Can we say that there is a need for this deconstruction of history in Morocco as well, to bring up also the history of violence that Morocco knew, and that we often tend to ignore, neglect, and pretend that it didn't happen?
Well, yes, I think so. Yes, I say yes, but I say yes hesitantly, because even though I'm a historian working in Morocco, I'm not a historian of North Africa or the Middle East, right? My area is Indian Ocean, British Imperial world, British colonial world. But yes, I think so, because I think that that history to a certain extent has been, whitewashed in Morocco to fit a nationalist narrative, like it is in just about every country around the world, right? Mm-hmm. Yes. I mean, the educational system, I mean, it does seek to educate, but it also seeks to educate citizens, right? To make citizens, right? Which is one thing that's different, between, historians, working in the archives and these other things compared to, the kind of history that's taught at in secondary education. So yeah, I mean, I think so. I'm always struck because many of the narrative. Whenever I teach Arab history at AUY, this comes up a lot, and I ask them if anything has changed in Morocco as a result of colonialism. And some people say it's better. Some people say there are these other things, but a lot of people say nothing really changed that much from pre 1912 with the Treaty of Fez to post 1956. You have the figure of the Sultan who becomes king. The king retains or resumes power, right, and brings the country along with Istiklal and other parties into independence. But I think colonialism definitely had a much larger impact in Morocco than is often commonly acknowledged. I mean, even in ways that might seem relatively meaningless to all of us, like what day is it today? The fact that
Yeah.
right? I mean, we're using a Christian calendar in Morocco.
Yes.
We might politicize it by calling it, Common Era now or whatever, right? But could you imagine going back, in Fez 300 years and telling them about this?
Yeah, they will be shocked.
They would be completely shocked, right? Absolutely. So, and we'd probably be shocked too, because a lot of things that are considered traditional Moroccan, aren't that old either, right?
Exactly. In Morocco, it's Saturday, Sunday.
That's
Yeah,
right.
but in other
Although I
yeah.
think this is very clever because, as we all know, most things shut down Friday afternoon. So I think this is a good way of working out a 2.5-day weekend. So I think they've got the right trick.
Exactly, yeah.
But absolutely, and I mean, yeah. So and we all know the other kind of cultural things, right? I mean, the coffee culture in Morocco, and of course, the patisserie, and these other things, right? I mean, these are kind of obvious things.
Exactly.
But one thing that's looked at is I hear from a lot of students, and for a lot of people, colonialism is simply the structures in which they were born and have to operate, right? And for a lot of people, colonialism may have been quite beneficial, or they may have done quite well under it. And especially looking at our next door neighbor to, Algeria, if you look at their decolonization struggle, it's of course much more violent than Morocco's decolonization struggle. But people were killed. Moroccan freedom fighters were gunned down in the Casablanca Marché.
Yeah.
Right, and those are, that's certainly not the only incidents of violence. And I do think that colonialism, it's something that gets sanitized, I think, quite quickly. And I think what a lot of people don't necessarily realize is just how racialized it was. I mean, people were simply not treated equally. There was this thing that the very famous Indian historian and theorist Partha Chatterjee called the rule of colonial difference. Britain and France, they go out in these colonial territories and they claim to be bringing the rule of law and getting rid of arbitrary oriental despotism and bringing development, or improvement was the 19th century British word for it. But it was based upon a system of overt discrimination. And yeah, so I think that there needs to be a more even look at these structures of colonialism. And that's, if I can tie this back into William Ferguson, just so that it doesn't seem like that is totally unrelated. But William Ferguson is traveling again in the 1730s, early Enlightenment, before what Chinese historian Kenneth Pomerantz called the Great Divergence. And this is the period around 1750, but some people push as far as 1800, when Europe actually starts economically taking off, right? It starts growing disproportionately to the economies of other parts of the world. China being the standard largest economy, world's richest nation in the past, right? And And before the Great Divergence, here we have Ferguson sailing before the Great Divergence, and he's much more even or much more open to, again, the ideas of non-European peoples. And again, he thinks that China should be the model for Europe. And he sails in the 1730s. He doesn't actually sit down to write his diaries until the 1760s, 30 years later, when he's an old man in retirement. And he still believes that China is the model that Europe should be looking toward. So this whole idea of European supremacy or the emergence of Europe is much later than is normally given credit to, or normally understood or realized by people. And that superiority, I think, comes with colonialism. And so, we're still living, I think, to a certain extent, with the after effects of that continue to promote white history, if we want to put it in your terms, right? European history or global North history over others. And we see this in the academy as well. And some of it's a problem of language, right? I mean, because you start thinking about it a little bit and you say, well, how do we actually do a proper global history? Does that mean that you have to learn Cantonese and Han Chinese, or Mandarin rather, and, Hindustani, and maybe some Persian, and then Ottoman Turkish, and then a whole bunch of European languages as well. And I haven't even touched on, indigenous languages in the Americas. So there are some of these, very real kind of impediments to looking at a global history. But the other issue is that, for the most part, historians working in global North universities, tend to have the most funding, or the universities tend to be the most well-funded, have the largest endowments. They can fund research and doctoral research and these other things. And when you have a lot of, particularly Anglophones working in English languages, in European or North American or Anglo universities, if you will, for the most part, they tend to study themselves. Most historians study their own culture. And so we get a disproportionate, so every year there's a disproportionate amount of new knowledge that continues to be created about the global North. And what's created about other parts of the world is really a fraction of that. And I'll give you an example. This is data that came out of the American Historical Association's trade magazine called Perspectives, and I'll provide you with the link. But they looked at 60 history departments in the United States, Canada, and Britain and Ireland. And I'll just read one section from them. But they say, for these departments in these Anglo global North universities, quote, Europe attracts 3 times as many historians as its raw population, i.e. as a percentage of global population would merit. The United States, around 4 times as many. And the United Kingdom and Ireland, the multiplier is nearly 20. So, for example, the UK and Ireland is 1% of total world population, according to this data from a few years ago. And the percentage of total historical research that's coming out about the UK and Ireland in these 60 departments counts for 19.6. Which is a huge disparity, right? Whereas, if I look at my own area, which is South Asia, it is 23.9. We can round up to 24% of the global population, yet 2.5% of total historical research is coming out. So we continue to see and this is why I think this post-colonialism idea matters, because the structures of post-European imperialism are still replicated in so many ways that we don't even think about, just due to the structural inequalities of power that continue to exist in the world.
Yes. Thank you a lot, Professor. Thank you a lot for all of these answers to our questions, and we definitely learned a lot.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I've really enjoyed it, and I look forward to seeing or listening to the other episodes of this podcast.